Let me introduce the mayor of Washington, D.C. He is widely seen as being a real supporter of startups, and many people see this as this going to be one of the legacies that he leaves as he for his tenure as mayor. So let me introduce the mayor, Mayor Vincent. Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to this next session of the Challenge Festival. I've been delighted to be a part of this. You know, we eagerly waited for this for months to come, and I swear it seemed like the week just went like that. We were together last Sunday as we kicked off things, and now it's Friday already. So we're going to extend it by 2 weeks, so just you can stay around for another couple of weeks if you like. I want to thank Chris for the very nice introduction. And I also want to thank Donna Harris and Evan Burfield for the leadership that they have provided not only on this effort, but also just the overall effort to help establish 1776 here in the District of Columbia and the major impact that it has had. Donna and Evan, stand up and be recognized. I don't think there's any question that the work that you've done is at 1776 is barely short of amazing, if not just plain amazing. You've helped to bring together, coalesce a tech scene that at best was disjointed in the District of Columbia and largely non-existent. And frankly, we as a district government were proud to be one of the first investors of $200,000 in helping get 1776 started, and look at it now. I want to acknowledge some people who are here today who have been absolutely instrumental in our efforts to engage with the technology scene here, and really, they saw the opportunities available and have really grabbed them. First of all, I want to acknowledge a man who we didn't even know each other before January of 2011, and now I feel like I've known him all my life. He is a man who has made such an enormous contribution to our economic development scene here in the District of Columbia, which includes, of course, our tech sector. Our Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, Victor Hoskins. Jennifer Boss, who is our Interim Director of Development. I don't know if Jen is here. Where is she? There she is. Aaron McKinney, who is our Tech Sector Manager, who took on this responsibility when Jen moved up to another position. And I also have to recognize a gentleman who was with us on this journey and then got recruited away by 1776. And we are happy for him because he's just an outstanding human being and has done a great job on this front, on the 1776 front, on the tech sector front, and so on and so forth. And that is David Zipper. David. You know, just 3 years ago, there was virtually nothing in the District of Columbia, certainly the district government front anyway, in terms of a presence with the tech sector. We kind of quickly discovered that there were great opportunities within the tech community to grow jobs and to be far more innovative than the district government had been. One of the things it did was help to pave the way for our 5-year economic development plan. And if you don't have a copy of this, we're down to our last 15,000 copies, and we'll be happy to. But you will find in this that there's a lot of emphasis on growing the tech sector. In fact, the two principal goals are to be able to create over the 5-year period 100,000 new jobs and to generate $1 billion in new tax revenue. And in fact, we measured the first year, that was the end of November in our first year, and we had generated somewhere between 17 and 18,000 new jobs, a number of which are in the tech sector, and about $280 million of new tax revenue in the pipeline for the District of Columbia, which means we obviously are on course to be able to achieve that goal. There are, in the plan itself, there are 6 major visions for transforming the city, and the 2 principal visions are to be able to become the most business-friendly economy in the nation and become the largest tech hub on the East Coast. And obviously both of those have major implications for our role in technology growth and technology development in the city. We've had a lot of success, and we've got so much more work to do, but we were one of the first investors, as I indicated, in 1776, and I hope I'm not wrong, but I think 1776 now, in just a little over a year, has created space for over 200 startups in the District of Columbia, and that is nothing short of absolutely phenomenal. They've created another floor. Well, I guess you added another floor to their arsenal and didn't create it. And they've now established a startup school called General Assembly at 1776 as well. You know, in addition to that, we've also established a marketing and branding campaign for the tech sector here in the District of Columbia. That is called Digital DC. And it really aims to bring more into the mainstream our emphasis, our focus on technology, if you will. We're really proud of, having established a tech corridor. For those of you who are familiar with the District of Columbia, it runs from roughly where the convention center is all the way north to Petworth, which will encompass one university, Howard University, as well. And what we hope happens is that becomes an area of concentration for tech firms and maybe some of the startups as they graduate and go on to more independence. That will be a place they can locate along that corridor and find synergy with others who are doing similar kinds of work in the District of Columbia. So we're very excited about that. We also have established a pilot tech fund in which we've put money. It will be available for people for a variety of purposes in order to facilitate the growth and development of the technology sector here in the District of Columbia. We'll see how that goes, and hopefully it goes well, and hopefully it will be further seeded and contributed to by the government, especially in the future. So we're really proud to be a partner with the startup community. In fact, we had a number of folks representing us in the startup community who went down in March to be brand ambassadors to South by Southwest. How many people in here attended South by Southwest in Austin? That is quite an experience, isn't it? It is phenomenal. And so a mixture of things, not just technology, but music and film and other things as well. In addition to that, we're not concentrating all of our technology efforts in the downtown area. We are looking at how we can use a huge tract of land, St. Elizabeth's East, which we own, which is about 180 plus acres of property, and that becoming a technology hub, a technology focal point, if you will, as well. In fact, we have Sidlum, which is a French-based firm that's bringing its North American headquarters to the campus of St. Elizabeth's. A couple of other firms, and one in particular that's coming to St. Elizabeth's. If we had talked about this beforehand, this firm coming to Ward 8 in the District of Columbia, been taken out in a straitjacket. And that's Microsoft. Microsoft is opening an innovation center on the grounds of St. Elizabeth's that will be a further catalyst for connecting people to technology and innovation. In any event, we're relatively new to the tech startup community. but we're not new to innovation. At least we like to think that we're not new to innovation in any event. We've been able to attract tremendous talent, and we think with our universities here, with Georgetown, George Washington, Howard, and the other universities, as people graduate or get advanced degrees beyond their bachelor's degree, they will opt to stay here in the District of Columbia and will become part of the increasing talent pool in the District of Columbia to be able to help facilitate the growth and development of our tech sector. I don't know how many of you all know this, but we are the #1 new tech hotspot in the nation. And it wasn't us that named ourselves either. These are all external affirmations of the direction that we're going. We're also, by the way, called the #1 best city for female entrepreneurs. So in any event, we think that the Challenge Cup Festival, which we are absolutely proud and delighted to be able to host, is a reflection of how far we've come in a short period of time. And we know, of course, we've got much more work to do. But we appreciate the collaborative ideas that we receive from the tech community, and the DC tech community has been absolutely wonderful to be able to work with. I want to congratulate you all on the panel that's going to be coming right after me. It's going to be a vigorous discussion, and I'm glad my Chief of Staff, Chris Murphy, is going to be a part of that. He does a great job for me and the city every day. And Chris, I want to publicly thank you for what you do every day. In any event, I suspect some of you are coming to the Lincoln Theater tonight. And we'll look forward to that, and I'll be there for that. I've tried to participate in as much as I could this week, recognizing that the city goes on. With that having been said, though, do I turn it back to you, Chris? All right. Well, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the panel discussion, and enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.
You guys come on up and start getting set up. Come on, guys, come on up and we'll get you wired as I babble on about something very, very important. A couple years ago, it was when I moved into the district, it was a time when it was not necessarily easy to be a district resident, so it's nice to live here now, and it's a lot easier. Thank you very much. I got a new trash can delivered last week. I was very excited. Yeah, baby. See, move into D.C. We're going to talk about, as you well know, if you're a startup and an entrepreneur, where you start your business is a big choice, and cities are starting to understand that too. And so we're going to look at how dashing they all are. My goodness, David Zipper is the managing director of 1776 Ventures, and he's going to be your leader. Please welcome David.
Well, thanks very much. The title today, how startups choose where to expand. This is a rich topic of conversation. I'm really looking forward to having a lively discussion with the panelists we have today. And I think it's a really important discussion because I think most mayors and most governors, if asked, will say, they want to encourage innovation. They want to be a hub of entrepreneurial activity. They want startups to locate in their cities and their states. When you get down to it, innovation, new business models can be disruptive, and there can be some incumbent groups that feel threatened. I think you can see that with, for example, Airbnb's expansion, and some of the resistance or questions are coming from hotel owners. And even when there isn't a group of incumbents that may push back immediately, you still have issues among regulatory agencies at the city and state level where they just aren't used to dealing with new kinds of business models, like driverless cars, and the questions that's all brought out. So there's a lot to talk about here, and we really have a terrific group of panelists to have the discussion. So I'll introduce them very briefly, and then we'll dive in. I will start right here with Brad Hargareves to my left. He is the co-founder of General Assembly, a a company that helps individuals develop entrepreneurial and technological skills. And he's played a central role in crafting General Assembly's business model and expanding it to 8 cities worldwide in just 2 years. And we're lucky enough at 1776, where I work, to have General Assembly be co-located with us. So Brad, glad you're here with us from New York. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving right along, Rachel Holt is the Regional General Manager for the East Coast for Uber. For those of you who don't know Uber, there may be 2 of you somewhere back there, I'm guessing. Uber is a transportation company that connects passengers with drivers of vehicle for hire and ride-sharing services, and has some new business lines as well. And Rachel oversees operations and expansion of Uber basically throughout the East Coast, from New Orleans to the East, and we're really glad to have you here. Rachel's also based here in Washington. And then sitting to Rachel's left is Chris Murphy, who was just mentioned by Mayor Gray. He's the Chief of Staff to the Mayor, and prior to joining the Gray administration, Chris was the Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and previously had founded and led City Year, the Washington chapter of AmeriCorps. So Chris, thank you for joining us. And finally, Jennifer Bradley, a fellow and senior advisor of the Brookings Institution Metropolitan Policy Program. She is a co-author of Metropolitan Revolution and an expert on really how cities are handling changes like the ones we'll be discussing in the United States and to a large extent globally as well. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. So Brad, why don't we start with you? I think it's great to get the entrepreneurial perspective to kick things off. You know, you've expanded rapidly to I believe 8 cities in a couple of years.
10 now.
10 now. Wow, I'm outdated. But you've had some bumps in the road recently with licensing, but not here in Washington. Can you give us an overview of what happened, I guess maybe starting in DC, but then also elsewhere?
Sure. To give you all a little bit of context into how we got here from General Assembly, we started in New York about 2-3 years ago, really with the idea that you have so many open roles in technology companies and technology and design roles in all kinds of companies, and just not the people to fill these jobs. It's one of the biggest limiting factors to the growth of the technology industry in metropolitan areas today is talent. On the other hand, you have a huge number of underemployed and underskilled young people who are often working in jobs that are dead-end careers, aren't what they want, aren't empowering them. So our mission is to empower individuals to pursue work they love, and we came to that by seeing that organic need through the community and teaching these 21st century skills like web development, user experience design, digital marketing in kind of short form, usually 2 to 4 month programs around the world. And we started doing this in New York about 3 years ago, and were surprised to find about a year after we started that there's an entire regulatory scheme around these types of programs, proprietary school regulation. So after initially freaking out, we started down the path of actually working with local governments to one, understand the rules. In most jurisdictions, most jurisdictions this is regulated by the states, since it falls under education. So we started working with various jurisdictions to figure this out. Since we're global, we had to figure this out not only in every state we're in, but also in the UK, Australia, and Hong Kong, where we opened international locations. So obviously it was a job, and we're lucky to hire Liz Simon, who was at the White House before this, to run public policy at GA. DC has been comparatively a breeze, and I can talk about why. California, on the other hand, while we're working through it, has been a lot more, I would say, a lot more challenging in the way the rules were structured. And there's also been a lot more press and attention around the issue, which hasn't happened in any other market, and actually, I think, complicates the issue even further when you start getting, when it gets into the public, people in government are a little bit more aware that people are watching them. There are challenges that crop up. So I would say it's been certainly the tale of two markets, DC versus California. Most have fallen in between those two.
Okay, thanks. So, Rachel, you were the general manager of Uber here in Washington when Uber made the decision to come into the city. So perhaps you can just tell us what your experience was like leading that expansion, and also, frankly, how you decided to move into the city in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So when Uber was back in, must have been September, October of 2011, which at this point seems like an eternity ago. When Uber thinks about where to go, of course we look at the business metrics. And one of the neat things about being a technology company, especially in the city space, is that you actually have all this data on whether people open the app, whether people are downloading your app, and actually are interested in the product even before you go. So anytime, even now when we expand, whether in the US or around the world, we have this robust set of data we call eyeballs, which is literally how many people are opening the app in a given location, how many people are pushing the button saying, hey, is Uber here yet? And so that's one of the factors. And then, of course, the other factor is the legal and regulatory scheme. And so for Uber, this often means really, really boring, specific sedan and limousine regulations, which I won't go too far into. But these are essentially the things that are the difference for us between whether or not Uber's is able to enter a certain market or isn't. So, for example, today we aren't in Miami, we aren't in Austin. Those are two markets we would love to be in because of rules on the books that say you can't get into a sedan and have it cost less than $70 in Miami. And so those kind of rules are literally prohibitive because part of what we do is are able to lower the cost of a ride to be able to take it 10 or 15 minutes down the road. And so when there are things like price controls in place, it makes it impossible for us to join. So getting back to DC, we saw at the time it was one of those markets that people were opening the app, they were pushing the button, trying to get a ride, and so then we went to our next step, which is reading the rules and the regulations. And at the time, I mean, DC was what Travis, our founder, calls white glove legal. I mean, it was as on the books. What we were doing was as clearly legal within the framework that DC had as anywhere. And so we were really excited about this combo of great business opportunity plus the regs. And so I came on board. I was living in San Francisco at the time. Wanted to move to DC and was determined to do a job that had nothing to do with politics. And so, yeah, little did I know exactly. So to move to DC, my husband makes so much fun of me about saying that. Moved to DC, we had. We found that drivers, sedan companies here were just so excited to have additional business opportunities. There was clearly a need on the supply side. There was clearly a need on the demand side. And Uber launched, and we saw market growth that we had never seen before. And it's still one of our biggest markets today, despite population-wise, it's certainly not being nearly as big as other cities. And then we were about a month and a half or so in, and I was, the whole team had and there were three of us, the whole team. There were three of us, and we went for coffee, and then we came back, and we looked on Twitter, and we heard that Uber was declared illegal at a meeting that the Taxi Commission had. And so, of course, we went into, panic mode at that point. And about 2 days later, so we kind of reached out. We said, hey, this is, I'm the general manager of Uber. We heard that something happened this morning. Can you tell us what it was? And got a form response back saying that someone would reach out within 24 hours, and then got an email later that day saying if you'd like to make an appointment, call this number. Called the number. It was the office was closed. And then the next morning, the taxi cab commissioner requested an Uber, had called the press before, and impounded a car, giving $2,000 of tickets to the driver, and of course, in front of the press who was there. So that was our introduction to DC, and it's been it's been one of the more interesting markets for us. It's certainly given me a quick education into policy and regulatory issues. And whenever you're doing something that's disruptive, that means you're disrupting something. And that means you're changing something, and something that's often been in place for a really long time. And so, in that time, there have been 19 times that the regulations have been proposed or changed, having to do with the 3 sections of code that impacts Uber. So needless to say, it's been let's call it an ongoing dialogue, to put it gently, with the city. And I think what we've seen here, and I think what Uber has seen, is really how important the voice of consumers are in causing regulatory change. And so, I think often about thinking back to when we started. Had we been a B2B company, we wouldn't have the same number of consumers that would have sent emails or would have made calls and said, hey, this is something that's really good, and this is something I don't want to have go away. And so, what we've relied on is really consumers to be our biggest advocates, because those are the folks that are every day. These are the folks that really see the impact that new technology and new products are making for them.
So, Chris, would love to hear your thoughts from within the Wilson Building, Washington City Hall, about new business models, like really both General Assembly and Uber, that are just not something the city has seen before.
Yeah.
How do you approach that?
I think first of all, I want to acknowledge that I think the city can be a little schizophrenic here, right? Because on the one hand, we say, we want you here, and we have a lot of, the mayor talked about some of the incentives we've tried to provide, some of the initiatives we've launched, because we really do see the tech sector as a critical component of the district's economy going forward as we seek to diversify the economy. And that's obviously incredibly important to us. At the same time, there's this thing called regulation. And it's probably worth at least just sort of putting the context. I know regulation, especially in this town, is kind of a dirty word. But it's important to sort of at least, I'd ask that folks at least appreciate where that comes from, right? It comes from a sense that the government has some responsibility to provide some protection for public safety, for consumer protection, as much as possible to allow there to be choice out there. And so there is some inherent tension there as the government seeking to provide those kinds of protections, because when something goes wrong, they're not going to they're going to look to the government, and they're going to say, how did you let this happen? So there is some tension there, and I think it's fair to say that we struggle a little bit with that tension. And I think we've seen some of the disruptive both technologies and companies come in, and it has been, that dialogue, and it's a conversation. Perhaps it does require a reg change here and there. I think we have tried to be reasonable about it. And it has required pushing people a little bit to think a little bit differently. But I think it's certainly a conversation that we've engaged in. We are always trying to get that line right between protecting public safety and consumer protection, and at the same time fostering startups. That line, depending on the industry, I think kind of moves and it shifts, right? So if it's something that's hyper consumer facing in that creates a situation where it really has a potential exposure for public safety, then there may be more of anxiety. If it's less consumer facing, less connected to public safety, then there's going to be less probably tension between those two goals. Do we get the line right all the time? Probably not. But please know that we're trying, and that I think we can only try to get that line right if we're engaged in a dialogue with the community itself.
Fair enough. So Jennifer, can you help us think more sort of beyond Washington? Because these themes that we're discussing, they come up in cities all around the United States and really all around the world. But since you have really more of a national and global perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the issues underlying them, and perhaps if there's a creative approach that another jurisdiction's taken.
Well, I think that what's come through on the panel is everybody likes disruption until it happens to them. So one of the things that this schizophrenia that Chris just referred to is that places are so eager to do new, exciting things to foster a startup or innovation culture. So they do, as the city has done with 1776, they support business incubators, and they support branding, and they do a lot of cluster development, right, to get entrepreneurs to come. And they don't look at their back-end regulatory systems. They don't look at the standard set of business regulations and consumer protection to see if the new things that they're giving versus the regulatory thicket are compatible. And I think that as places start to encounter more regulations, more industries that are trying to or more companies, sorry, that are trying to disrupt highly regulated industries, they'll be forced to look at, kind of the goodies and the baddies of government, right? The goodies that they give and the regulations that they put on new businesses. One of the interesting things about startup culture, Rachel, you mentioned that you're not in Austin. Uber's not in Austin, but they are in Corpus Christi, Texas. I'm from Texas. Nobody thinks of Corpus Christi as a particularly entrepreneurial hotbed. But I think that's an interesting point. Austin has this reputation for being progressive and fabulous and groovy and wonderful, and I grew up there, and it is all of those things. But part of what has given cities a progressive reputation often is a pretty high degree of consumer protection. Consumer protections are the same things that Chris was talking about that are causing this friction with an Uber, with an Airbnb, or with General Assembly in California. Places that have maybe not bulked up consumer protection, places like Corpus Christi, have a more open environment for certain kinds of entrepreneurial and disruptive ventures. Right? Oklahoma City was recently named by the Kaufman Foundation as one of the most entrepreneurial cities in the United States. That could be because the city and state tend to have a kind of lower regulatory hurdle, a more let's wait and see approach to consumer protection. I don't know of any city that seems to have really gotten it right. I do think that there are tools, things like design thinking, that can help cities maybe be a little more open and experimental. No one in government wants to move fast and break things, but I think they could be open to, on some kinds of industries, having a more let's see what happens, right? So for example, if somebody feels that something has gone wrong with General Assembly or with a coding academy, what they've lost is time and they've lost money. Government and the legal system is pretty good at helping. There's a set of systems there that can help you with a remedy, certainly for the lost money. If somebody's injured in, because of Uber or Airbnb, it's a lot harder to find a satisfying remedy, right, if you've been assaulted or if there's been a terrible accident. So government might have to adjust the regulations for different kinds of businesses based on the potential harm. That then opens up a whole other problem because government is supposed to treat people equally. And right, why is General Assembly going to get a free ride if Uber is having to deal with these issues? There's no good way to solve this in a blanket method, right? If everything is going to have to be, I think, provisional and worked out, and then you'll have places that figure it out again as best they can for a while, and ideally will share those across different governments so everybody can kind of learn from each other. But we are running a kind of open experiment in government regulation for disruption. And it's going to be longer than most people would like, and it's going to be more painful than most people would like. And then once we get a set of regulations, there's going to be a whole new set of technologies, whether that's driverless cars or flying segways or whatever, we're going to have to open it up all again. So for people like me who just think and propound about these things, it's a guarantee of full employment for the rest of my life, and I'm happy about that. For people who are developing and implementing these technologies, it's a problem, and it's something that they're going to have to build into their business model as this regulatory lag time.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you for that image of flying segways. I appreciate that.
I want mine.
Yeah, really. So just let's go a couple of questions a little bit deeper into some of the issues we've been discussing so far, and then we'll open it up. But just a quick question to Brad and Rachel. Brad, when you were going to come into Washington, before you opened up the facility at 1776, did you or did you not approach the Office of the State the State Superintendent for Education, OSSE, about the regulatory approvals you would need?
Yes, we did.
You did.
So, and that's one of the reasons I think DC went very well for us is that we had a partner on the ground very early on in 1776 that was able to facilitate those connections, build bridges. They already had a relationship with the mayor's office. Having that partner on the ground in 1776 was incredibly important in getting us on the right foot in DC.
So OSSI was aware of General Assembly coming in before you opened your doors and started teaching anyone. Is that right?
I believe so,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I know we had built a relationship with the mayor's office.
Now, Rachel, did you approach anyone in city government before Uber began serving people? No, we'll get to you next, Chris, don't worry. But did you approach anyone in city government before you started serving folks?
No. And that's generally, we often will email or have some interaction, especially now. We'll have a lot more interaction. Frankly, at that time, no one knew who we were. No one would have taken our call at that point. But I think, but now we do sometimes engage. But I think part of how we operate and kind of the modus we believe is that when something is legal and okay, if we're not going to push forward and we're not going to demonstrate to the city firsthand through our product the impact that it can have, we're not going to be, just quite frankly, we wouldn't be in 120 cities right now or around the world. And there are folks that are in the same space that have taken a different approach, and they're in many, many, many fewer cities. And so I think that when the best value of your product is demonstrated through consumers, through drivers and partners that are making a better income because of it, I think it's important to demonstrate on the ground versus asking permission before.
Okay, it's an interesting difference there. So, Chris, from the mayor's office perspective, would you want entrepreneurs with new business models to be approaching the city before they begin providing that service or product?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. The answers to the questions were sort of do you ask for permission or forgiveness, right? And I think. I mean, it's interesting. It's a very interesting question. It's hard to go back in time and try to answer the question, what would I have done then? I think nowadays tech is so important to the district. And, with the deputy mayor who's here, Deputy Mayor Hoskins, has made tech such an important piece of our economic development strategy that I would like to think, and we have got staff folks that work specifically with the tech community. I'd like to think that if Uber had come to us, certainly if it came to us now, they might not start at the taxi commission. They might start with the tech folks, and that might lead to a different conversation than starting with the hardcore regulator. I'd like to think that. So yeah.
I got to meet David pretty early on, so that's how we met.
That's true.
Well, and can I add one other thing?
Yeah, please.
I think to Jennifer's point about regulation, which I think is very valid. One of the things that we were pleased to do when the deputy mayor worked with the mayor to develop our 5-year economic development strategy is set a goal that is probably, to folks who've been in the D.C. regulatory world for a long time is laughable, which was to make D.C. the most business-friendly municipality in the country. There are some reasons that present challenges, including some of those that you alluded to. Sort of, we're a very progressive jurisdiction, and when you're trying to be very progressive and sort of consumer-oriented, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to being business-friendly. So we're kind of in uncharted water. But one of the things we were really pleased to do is actually appoint a business regulatory reform task force. And we're glad that Rachel agreed to be on it. We were kind of hoping she'd bring, and I know she did, bring some of her kind of startup DNA to the work of that task force. The report is coming out next week, and we've already started implementing some of the recommendations, one of which was to take the 8 different offices that any startup in DC had to get permission from and go through the regulatory process, create one website that was seamless. So you go to one portal that will guide you through that process. It will not be completely painless, but it will certainly be a lot less painful than it was. So I think that is an example of how we're trying to kind of play catch-up a little bit with the startup community.
Very good. I think that this question of cities being proactive or reactive in terms of disruptive technologies entering a market, sort of begs the question of just how much control does a governor or a mayor really have over the process, really any elected officials, period. So I'm curious, Jennifer, if you work with mayors and elected officials all around the country, if someone came to you and said, what can I do to sort of really get my arms around these sorts of challenges that are buffeting my administration, what would you suggest?
I think it's interesting that you bring up both governors and mayors, because they're not always on the same page by any stretch of the imagination. I think that every city is in its own kind of nested regulatory environment. So the first thing I would recommend for a city that wants to avoid these kinds of things is to be both outward-facing and inward-facing. Outward-facing would be to work with other like-minded mayors to try and get a handle on state regulations. What is the state kind of binding you to, and where is their flexibility when it comes to regulations around education or lodging or healthcare, any of these industries? And the other is to, bridge the gap, right, between the Regulatory Reform Task Force and hardcore regulators in places like the Taxi Commission. How much house cleaning do you need to do, right? So the $200,000 grant or the fund that you're going to do for venture could get eaten up really quickly if you haven't done the back end changes, and you still do have 8 agencies as opposed to 1 that a new business has to go through. And I feel like that because there is so much energy and publicity around Uber and Airbnb and these other kind of really sexy tech-based businesses, that will actually have a great ripple effect, because it shouldn't be any harder for me to open up a cupcake stand or a shoe shine stand or a hair braiding salon than it is for Uber or General Assembly or anybody else to get moving. And when you said that, if Uber had gone to the deputy mayor who was interested in technology as opposed to DCRA, they might have had a different response. But what about the totally unsexy, not tech business that doesn't necessarily have cachet? What I'm hoping is that the additional social good, right, of a GA or an Uber kind of bearing the battle scars, is that it's easier for the everyday entrepreneur who, may or may not even have a website, because fundamentally they are also job creators, and they are also bringing value, and they are also part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and part of the same air that's going to make a place a good place to live, a good place to do business for startups and whatever the opposite of legacy businesses are.
So obviously, there's many Challenge Festival entrepreneurs, participants in the audience right now. All of them are in a regulated sector: energy, healthcare, education, smart cities, as we call it, transportation, other areas. And ultimately, they need the support of government for what can be a disruptive business model. Maybe different agency, different person, but there needs to be some sort of an education process, usually, to bring along those regulators, those officials, to see the value in what's being provided. So Brad and Rachel, whoever wants to take this one, I'm interested if you have tips to the entrepreneurs out there in terms of how that education process can be successful.
Yeah, so I think General Assembly, we take a little bit of a different perspective on some of this than many startups, in that we really welcome appropriate regulation in this space. Education is one of those spaces where consumers can be taken advantage of. There are a lot of very unfortunate stories out there of time and money and hopes being lost by people who invest in the wrong kind of education by the wrong provider. And the for-profit education space has not gotten a good rap, and very justifiably so, based on some of the practices they've adopted in the past 10 years. So when we go to regulators, we come with the perspective of we welcome regulation and we understand why this regulation exists. Let's work together to adapt the regulations to this new sector, of which General Assembly is the leading member. And we look at it from an education perspective, being an education company, of how can we bring the regulator in and say, usually working with someone perhaps more in a tech policy or an economic development role, to bring the regulator in and say, here's what we do, here's why it's beneficial to the community, and here are the things, and basically, here's the model policy that we believe needs to be adopted to foster this space and help get people jobs and fill those roles in tech companies. So we approach it, and this is one of the reasons California has been challenging, is really before that process got started, several other companies in the kind of coding education world realized that there was this regulation in place and have went the bring it to the press route and start a fight. And we found ourselves in a very awkward position where we do run this type of education. We are in a similar sector, but we look at regulation in a very different way than other companies in that space. So we've kind of had to go back and say, okay, great, let's diffuse the fight that started, and let's actually figure out the right way and the right role of regulation in this emerging sector. And over the last couple of months, we've been very successful doing that.
I think, I think in some ways the key piece, the key piece for us, and it's not dissimilar from what Chris was saying, is regulation that's there for consumer safety, for, in our case, driver safety, are really important. But there's also a whole set of other regulations that we see, ones that have been proposed and ones that are in place in certain places, like requiring printers in every car, that simply are kind of a look backwards. And there's no, at this point, it's impossible to say that has a huge consumer safety benefit that's necessary and worth the cost and everything else. And I think, I think the second piece is as you're talking to folks, kind of try and prevent them from saying, well, because of this, in 5 years, here's what the world's going to look like. Because that's something I hear all the time in conversations that we have with local governments or regulators, and I try and stop them and say, with all due respect, if 5 years ago any of us knew that Uber was going to be what it is today, we would have all dropped whatever we were doing and started it. And I think there is, I think part of the education is how do you create frameworks that do allow a new business model to come up, and don't say that even the way we are today, whether that's including something like Uber, is kind of what we should freeze in time, because in 2 years there may be another company that comes along and does the flying Segway or the next thing. And how do you kind of create sensible frameworks that protect consumers, of course, but also allow something none of us have even thought about to be possible.
So, Chris, we've heard some advice for mayors that want to sort of wrap their arms around these sorts of trends. What advice would you have for the entrepreneurs that we've been talking about in the room? What sort of, if they want to convince others that they're here to help?
Ironically.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess two things. One, I think now that the DC government is, I think, more startup friendly than it ever has been. I think I can say that pretty confidently, that we get tech now better than we ever have. That's probably not to say we fully get it, but I mean, we're better off now. I would say come talk to us. I mean, that's number one. I think the other piece is, there are institutional roles that different actors play, right? So if you're a startup, you are going to have tunnel vision for the success of your startup, and I get that and I appreciate that. The government has a broader role, and although startups should stay tunnel vision on the survival and hopefully thriving state of their startup, they have to at least be aware that government does have a bigger role here, and that it has to take other perspectives into account when making decisions that do have long-term impacts. And that if they don't, there are pretty negative consequences that can come up. So if you're not aware and you're sort of blind to those, it's going to mean when you're making your case and your argument, you're going to get hit with a lot of questions that you're not ready to answer. So be aware of that and be ready to address some of those, I think, legitimate concerns.
Jennifer, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well on tips for the entrepreneurs in the audience or those that are watching from elsewhere. Before you speak, I should just mention that we have a little bit of time, I believe, for questions. So for those that have them and want to start thinking about what it might be, I think there's a floating mic out there, but please.
I think it's incumbent upon everybody in the regulatory process to keep the conversation going about how we change what regulation is. We have, certainly at the federal level, and I think this has worked its way through the state and local level, we have a set of regulations that were beautifully designed for mid-20th century ways of doing business. And we haven't necessarily thought about regulation as a flexible system. I was really impressed with the panel this morning talking about how government is actually, by its nature, slow-moving, conservative with a small c. That's what legal systems do. They build in predictability and sameness and constancy. We have an economy that is, what we're really disrupting is our whole kind of traditional legal system. That is going to take a lot of patience and dialogue to work out. And it's going to take people from across, I think, the entrepreneurial sectors talking to each other, right, and sharing information, not just about, where's the best place to go for, startup support, but what have you learned about approaches to regulation? Not automatically thinking of regulation as a set of terrible, nasty, smothering rules, but thinking of regulation as almost like a language, right, or a series of rules in a game that you play. You have to have boundaries. Languages have boundaries, right? And if you're coders, you understand that there are certain things, there's a syntax in a language. Regulation is like that. If you can start to think of regulation as a language with a syntax, that's something that you can develop and extend and engage in, maybe that will make you friendlier to the process that you have to engage in, so that these are not kind of hostile fights between, the forces of progress and the forces of darkness, and, whoever you want to map yourself onto, whether you map that onto government or one of the disruptors. But we are all developing this regulatory code, and I like the idea of kind of playing with code in both senses, right? Legal code and the code that you use to build in an app. How do we bridge that gap? And it's only by coming together and understanding it's the responsibility of both sides, as painful or as uncomfortable as that might be.
Great. So it would be great to get some questions from the audience. I have to admit, I can barely see from back here, so I'm not sure if there's floating mics out there. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask about disability enterprise and entrepreneurships in regards to the private industry as well as governmental. There's a large deaf community here. When they want to call a cab, there'd be a great app if you just hit it and a cab could come. But how do you initialize a business for that? For example, if I want to find an interpreter, I have to pay out of pocket, or agency has to pay out of pocket. How do we get venture capital to invest in services towards disabilities? Or, for example, General Assembly. As a developer, I pay for certain fees, but then you would have to, who would pay for the interpreting services in that foray? So there's certain barriers that we need to break down for, not just for deaf people, but disabled people in general. So how do you approach that?
So just to I know we've actually recently started looking into how we address disabilities in our courses, and it's something that we're actively looking at. And I know one of the great things about regulatory schema is they do help us think about these things, and they push us to do that, which is a good thing for society. Even if it's initially not cost effective, it's a good thing to do. So we are looking into that. I know that we have had our first few students in courses, I think actually one or two here in DC, that have special needs. So I know it's something that we're working on and actively pursuing. To speak to the broader question about the venture ecosystem, I think this speaks to the need for new types of funds and new types of entities that address these issues. Traditional venture funds are looking for the largest possible market, so they're looking for something anyone can use, which does tend to work to the detriment of minorities and people with special needs. So I think it does speak to the need for special types of venture funds and funding vehicles for new enterprises.
Just one thing. I think this is a great example of why government does have a role to play. Because one of the things that government does is spreads the cost of individual incident, right? So that the people who have different abilities than the mainstream are not forced to bear those costs always themselves at every turn. So this is just a great example of the way a government parameter, right, around accommodation or around transport or around education can say, no, you do have to serve everyone, so it's not always the people themselves who bear it. If we look at regulation in that way, kind of the upside and the theory or the larger principle of inclusion behind regulation, again, I think we might be able to have a more productive conversation than if regulation is just a series of no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you must. That if we get to the kind of human understanding of why we would have a law like that in the first place.
Additional, do we have time for another question?
I'm going to take a chance. Chris, and I'm going to press you a little bit, and Uber and I have not spoken at all, but
it all comes back to
I'm a heavy user, but I think it's not atypical of the challenges that a lot of communities are going through. And as the Taxi Cab Commission was doing its thing, whatever you call whatever it did, everyone agrees that safety is important. And yet it felt like that really the Safety Cab Commission was looking out for their taxi companies, and us users were frankly, I mean, I've been in a lot of DC cabs, and don't tell me that they're safe. So it's not a safety issue, right?
And I apologize in advance because you don't want to talk about 5 years from now, but let me say 5 years from now. So, what we heard, and again, it is not a startup's job to think about the broader world, right, in an ecosystem in which it exists. It's not necessarily the consumer's job to think about the broader ecosystem, right? The consumer should make the choice rather that maximizes their preference. So, and that's all well and good, but there is this bigger picture, this sort of pesky bigger picture that government does have to wrestle with. And so what the taxi drivers, and I'm not particularly beholden to the taxi drivers, but I think what they would say is, this feels unfair to us because this is creating two different rules, right? So one group has to play by one set of rules, another competitor in a similar market gets to play by a different set of rules. This disadvantages us. It's going to put us out of business, and then how are you going to feel? How is the city going to feel if it only has one provider of that service, right? So the city does have a responsibility to say, well, look, we're not trying to favor folks, but we're also not trying to disadvantage folks, and we want to ensure there's choice. And so we have to step back, I think reasonably and appropriately step back and say, how do we allow there to be choice, but at the same time not accidentally put our thumb on the scale or one side of the scale that means that there comes a day when there is no more choice. So, it is hard to predict 5 years, and in 5 years it's going to be somebody else up against Uber because we're going to have these segways that fly through the air. And we'll have to wrestle with this all over again then. But I think the city is going to any city is going to have to be asking similar questions about what is this going to do long term.
Feels a little bit like they were protecting choice by not giving us a choice, but I'll let it go. Yeah.
You say that until there are no more choices.
Okay, it's on. Just a question for, I think, the panel in general. It feels like maybe there's a broader framework in play here, and I think, Jennifer, as you articulated, we have a regulatory system that was great for the mid-20th century, and part of the legacy of that is that taxi cabs, which frankly as a DC resident had been horrendous for an extended period of time. It wasn't like they were aggressively moving forward with great customer service and gosh darn it, Uber came along and disrupted that plan. Universities, a lot of these institutions haven't really faced competition for a long period of time. And what's now occurring is you have startups, obviously Uber and GA and many in the room, that are starting to look at those and go, well, wait a second, we might be able to come in at a tenth the price with a radically better service and literally outcompete government or government-regulated entities. But then what we're also seeing, which is one of the most fascinating things to me in DC, is if you've been in a DC taxi cab in the last 18 months, holy crap, have they gotten better. They're polite, they're clean, they got these new flashy things on top that tell you if you can get in them. It seems like there is almost this broader frame going, and I was wondering if the panel wanted to discuss a little bit.
Uber is a sponsor today, right? Just checking.
I think it's a great point. I mean, I think in some ways this is the great thing, one of the many great things about startups, right, is that they disrupt, and then whatever they're disrupting has to adapt. And, you know, you have seen the taxi cab industry adapt. Now, some of that's been volitional. The smiles, you know, to the extent that you get one, is volitional. You know, to the extent that the new signs on the tops, that's regulatory, right? They were required to do that. But I think in the old days, I mean, this is where Uber was our best friend, right? In the old days, the taxi cab industry would have fought us, the city, hook, line, and sinker on that. And Uber allowed us to say, guys, do you see what we're seeing? You're getting your tails kicked here. You got to adapt. You got to, you know, welcome to the 21st century. And they have responded, and they have increased their service. And in some ways, that's good for consumers and it's good for the city because they're now giving Uber, you know, more competition than they previously were. When everyone said, "Oh my God, you know, it's Uber or nothing," now people are like, "Well, cabs are better. I can actually use a credit card. Maybe I'll think about that." So I think from a consumer perspective, I actually think it's been wonderful, truly wonderful.
Evan, just to build on that, one point I wanted to make, I think one of the differences between Uber and GA is that Uber, it's very clear who they're disrupting. They're taking money out of the pockets of taxi cabs and putting it into their own. Sorry for the blunt metaphor, but like, for us, it's actually not that clear. Because you say we're disrupting universities, well, you know what? 98% of the students who go to GA already have a bachelor's degree. So they're not going to universities so they can go to GA. And what we're selling is a lot higher on the on Maslow's pyramid. I mean, we're selling self-actualization. So it's a lot less clear what established and entrenched industry we're disrupting. And I think one of the reasons that regulators have been so keen to talk to us, other than the fact that what we're selling is awesome, and totally changes lives, is that there's not an entrenched lobby that's out there saying, no, you can't do this, this is bad, we're going to lose our shirts. It doesn't exist right now.
Brad, I have to ask you a question to follow up on that, though. My understanding, though, is that there are other groups like General Assembly out in the market now, and there's something of a competition, sort of like a race to the shortest. In terms of the length of period that a class could be to teach you how to code, from 12 weeks to 10 to 8. So I'm wondering, like, will there come a point, do you worry, that there could become an entrenched group pushing back, which could be those who paid a lot of money for a class that is just too short or is not designed in a way that provides that guaranteed job that they're expecting?
Well, I eventually hope there will be an entrenched group, and it's us.
So, on the other side.
I feel like, you know, not to be glib about it, I do worry about, you know, you just saw Kaplan launch Metis, which is a boot camp and a competitor of GA's in Boston. And this is one of the reasons I support regulation in this space, because it terrifies me that traditional for-profit education players are going to enter this space and are going to bring the bad practices that they acquired doing what they do, selling degrees, into this ecosystem. And it's going to, not because they're going to outcompete us, but because they're going to poison the well. They're going to bring a bad rap to this space, and it's going to kill everybody. That's what worries me, and that's why I support regulation in this space.
It's okay. It's owned by the Washington Post, so you're fine. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Who are you?
My name is Charles Wang, and I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii, and I'm in the clean tech sector.
Are you on Airbnb? Can we come visit you?
Absolutely, but please visit some of the hotels. There's some really beautiful hotels out there as well. But I just wanted to kind of comment on, just to let you know the space, the reason why we're here. One of the things that's happening is Senator Schatz over at the Hill is doing a wonderful job pushing sustainable and renewable energy and representing Hawaii very well and the rest of the nation. And also the event that 1776 is holding has drawn us out of paradise for this beautiful weather to join you guys today. And we see so much innovation that's coming out here. We're very excited. But everyone knows the story of Netflix and Blockbuster. If you don't know the story, there's no more Blockbuster. Well, this is really what we're talking about in Disturbance. And, you know, just a quick wrap up, they went to Blockbuster and Viacom asked, let's work together. And they went with the approach of Olive Branch. Viacom didn't want to work together. And this is the result, you know, 15, 20 years later, after the crazy fees and the bad service, there's only one entity left. Now, I wanted to ask a question to Rachel. Did you or have the cab commissions or other companies approach you folks, or have you reached out to them to work together, or maybe they wanted to buy you guys out in some sense? Is that conversation happening, or is that a conversation you hope to happen? And just to give you guys for market insight for you, last night after the gala, the party, it was so busy we couldn't catch an Uber ride, and we actually had to take a DC cab, and it was a great experience. And I'm sure. But just to let you know, the app that the DC cab drivers want is the app that finds Uber drivers. So if no one's working on that, you know, you guys should do that. And they told us to take that to the union. So, but are those conversations happening? You know, would you want to be, you know, do you want to work together? Or now you guys are getting so much traction, it's kind of, let's be Netflix, and if Blockbuster goes away, Blockbuster goes away.
Well, I think one of the big misnomers is that it's Uber versus taxi drivers. So many of the many drivers that work on the Uber system are former taxi drivers, are current taxi drivers. First of all, Uber has a product that actually partners with taxi drivers. But when Uber enters a market, what it creates is more better paying driving jobs. And that helps drivers, right? That helps people whose industry is to drive other folks for a living. And so, you know, what we've seen in a city like Miami is actually the taxi, you know, one of the taxi unions is our biggest supporter. And they are dying to have Uber enter the market, because what has been present in that industry for so long is a medallion system, which means it limits the number of people that can literally hold the ownership of the right to operate a taxi. To a very small group of people who are making a lot of money, right? And drivers, you know, are forced to rent their taxis in many cities for $100+ a day just for the right to operate a taxi. It takes them till 4 p.m. just to break even on the amount of money that they're providing to taxi company owners. And so what you see in many cities, and DC has a slightly unique system in that front, but what you see in many cities is it's not the taxi drivers versus Uber. It's the company owners, and it's the folks that have been making a lot of money for a long time off holding a limited asset. And when Uber comes in, that asset, you know, in certain cases, and we actually don't even see that there's any change in medallion prices, because they're so, the price, you know, it costs, I don't know if you guys know this, it's $1.2 million is the value of a medallion, which is the right to operate a New York City taxi. Those folks that hold those $1.2 million assets, they're not the drivers, right? And so I think, you know, I think that's one of the places. So, you know, here we partner with, you know, we actually have a product that connects residents, you know, folks with DC taxis. But the vast majority of the drivers that are on Uber at one point were DC taxis drivers, are still DC taxi drivers. And when for 5 years DC didn't allow any new drivers to get permits, those are a lot of the guys that joined Uber.
That's also a regulatory issue. They're not only allowing so many for some reason, and it doesn't feel like looking out for consumers. Hi.
Hi, I'm Josh Mandel. I work at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Just one quick comment and then a question. I would hate for everyone at this conference to go away thinking that everyone in government, especially here in Washington, kind of puts on their tweed and their Stetsons and goes punches cards and is working in a completely antiquated environment and not trying to really come up with new ideas. Because the people that I actually go in and work with every day are working completely outside of any box, especially when it comes to supporting entrepreneurs. So just to echo what my colleague Doug Rand from the White House had said earlier, every day we go to work a lot of us left the private sector to go and actually think of ways that we can actually help not just big business but startups, and I have a lot of tangible examples of those kinds of programs. But that being said, I just had a question for the panel. There are these conferences, it's a question on the patchwork of policies that exist throughout the states and the cities. There are these conferences of governors, of mayors, of state legislators. Are those good platforms, you think, for actually encouraging a little bit of alignment between some of these policies and some of these with some of these policymakers? And who would be the right person and or group to actually start that conversation so these guys can actually start thinking alike and make it easier for startups? Because right now it seems like that patchwork is a real obstacle for innovation happening in this country.
Damn that Constitution. But yes, go ahead.
I mean, first of all, I echo and support the idea that people in government are not the enemy. They're creative, energetic people who really are trying to solve problems. I think that you raise an interesting question, though, about, and I think some at the local level might say that is the kind of question that somebody who works for the federal government would ask. I think the federal government tends to value uniformity. Some industries also value uniformity, but the reason we have 50 states and so many local governments is so that we can run all these kinds of experiments. And the people and the leadership of a state like Oklahoma are going to want a different place on this, are going to be at a different place on the sliding scale between protection and market exuberance than people in a state, you know, stereotypically, right, like Massachusetts. So I think that governors and mayors can, you know, work on model platforms, right? They can have conversations about these shared issues. They can learn from each other. But that incredible diversity is built into our system, and it's how we learn what works and what doesn't work. And it's also how we address the fact that what I think works is not necessarily what anybody else on this panel is going to think works. And we should all have a place to express our sense of the regulatory trade-offs and mix that we want. So there is a lot of inefficiency built into the federalist system, but it's also what allows innovation and creativity to arise. So I don't know that there is one standardized place. I think that the United States government, you know, the federal government, through HUD or Department of Commerce or Department of Transportation, can do a lot with data and maybe promulgating kind of model codes or just helping aggregate up the data, collecting all that we learn from these experiments and having platforms so that people can make decisions. But a system that would enforce regulatory constancy among states on it that may not want it on some of these issues, I think would be a mistake.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I should note, too, that there are a number of organizations that pull together, in particular mayors, like the Mayors Innovation Project, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, that are participating in Challenge Festival activities specifically because they want to act as brokers connecting with some of the entrepreneurs that they're meeting this week and can link them back with particular mayors and particular governors that have a particular interest in that issue and are comfortable with that level of regulatory scrutiny, to Jennifer's point, which I think is a great one to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists for a very robust discussion, let's put it that way, for the last hour or so. I think everybody went into this knowing we were going to have an active debate, and everyone has embraced it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, you win the award for the best shoes. There you go, best shoes, awesome. And we didn't even bring up Tesla, for God's sake. States saying Teslas can't be sold places. Thank you guys all very much.